So guys, I'm going to talk a little bit about just measuring losses that we might get purely off the front, and I'll leave it to the likes of Brett and Cassie to talk about machine losses. So look, the front losses we'll focus on now, but I would just point out that we probably need to do a pre-evaluation. If we're just having a scratch around on the ground, you obviously need to do a pre-eval. Who at the moment, quick show of hands, who pulls up and has a bit of a look at what they're doing with the front? Who's scratching around on the ground at the moment? Quick show of hands. What do? Just pull up, jump out before you spread over it, and have a look at what's on the ground. Who then does a pre-eval first? Who goes and has a look on the ground before they put the harvester in the paddock? Hands up again. Good work. Okay, so look, that's pretty important because obviously that provides us with a baseline to evaluate anything that we're losing off the machine, but also specifically off the front. So that pre-eval's important, and what we need to do is excuse me, is be very careful in looking around on the ground and trying to have a bit of a scratch around and see what we potentially may have lost through shattering or shedding prior to putting the harvester in the paddock. So how do we do that? Well, we can measure the number of seeds in a defined area. If we've got a likes of a bushel plus tray, you can do it with that, which is about 0.1 of a square metre, or we can use a regular quadrant. And a good friend of ours, Glenn Reithmuller, uses a 316mm quadrant and has some seed numbers here that represent 100 kilogram per hectare loss. Okay, so 27 seeds in a standard quadrant represents 100 kilograms per hectare of loss. Canola, you're looking at about what is it, 267. So I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, for some of those other larger crops, coarser grains, it's a little bit easier. But we can get down to something like canola, we need to think a little bit differently. Otherwise, you know, both our accuracy and method of testing for loss is going to be compromised by the number of fingers and toes we have. All right, so we're talking about machine losses, and in particular front losses. One option we've got is to use the narrow tray that comes with a bushel plus setup, or something like Rod Gribble's harvest calc trays, again pretty small. And what we want to do is we want to sneak into the crop and place those at various sections across the front width, probably with a focus on the center. Okay, and that's where typically we're going to get the majority of our losses off the front. Okay, so the only thing we need to be careful of there is that we need to watch out for those big round black things that roll over the top of trays nicely. And while Pete probably be happy to sell you some more trays, I'd suggest it might become a bit of an expensive exercise. So watch out for where your wheels are going to run, and put your trays down, drive over the top, and then of course you need to then measure what's in those trays prior to spreading material from the rest of the machine. So you any material off your sieve, so your chaff and or straw material. So the alternative we've got is to drop the trays off the front and then have a look around underneath the tray that's dropped off the front. And material caught by the machine, or caught in the tray, will be from the machine, and material underneath the tray will be probably, you can isolate that to just material that's been lost off the front. But I would say to you that, again, something like canola, that's pretty tricky. And you do need to also take into account any losses that you might have had pre-harvest there as well. So where are we going to drop trays, or where are we going to place trays for the front? Well, look, I'd suggest we probably want to put trays across the width of the front, just so that we've got a bit of a bead on whether we're losing material as a result of, you know, the knife not doing a good job, or not being able to sweep material back in onto the front. You know, whereabouts are those losses occurring? And you'll see that we've got a lot of trays sort of positioned here across the front, and then one sort of towards the back of the machine. And typically what we'd try and do is put that centre one in an area that potentially is going to pick up any losses that we might have off the front. But you might also want to make sure that you pull up again before you're spreading material from the rest of the machine over that tray. But after the majority of the machine's moved over, because you could be picking up some leaks out of the machine as well that you can then go looking for. So placement's probably pretty important, and again, just focus on that center, because that's where we're typically going to find losses. With regard to drop trays, there are a few on the market. Just be sure that you've got a drop tray that's going to provide you with a calculator so that you can actually do some analysis of the data you collect. Make sure you've got one that covers the tray as it sits up underneath the axle. Otherwise, you're going to get superfluous material in that. And make sure that you've got something that's going to separate the sample that you collect in the tray as well. Some do come with that and some don't. So just make sure that you've got that. The Bushel Plus is probably the Rolls Royce of them all, and we've used that in a lot of testing that we've done. So we've talked a little bit about what's acceptable in terms of machine losses, and the point's been made, and it's a very good one, is that it's a bit of a balancing act. You know, the ASABE, the Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers, sort of say anywhere between 1% and 3%, depending on the crop type. Well, that's a guideline as such. But you know, the machine loss can come in, machine cost can come into play as well. So there has to be a trade-off between machine cost, and that's going to decrease as ground speed or capacity increases. And potentially that's typically as we find losses increase as that ground speed increases as well, just because the machine gets to a point where it can't actually stomach as much as we're throwing at it. But there's that sweet spot's going to be in the middle. You can see in this example, it's about 7 k's an hour, and there has to be that trade-off between the two. In terms of the front itself, I think it's important to just focus on the basics and getting those right. You know, a nice level cut. We need to make sure that we're presenting material into the harvest that's as even and uniform as possible. Nice level cut across the front, important, means that everything is running straight. Make sure draper belts are tensioned correctly. Make sure that you know how to adjust your retractable finger timing so that you're not getting repeats of material coming back in over the top of the drum. And look, you know, guys, there's this big book that, or there's a couple of them probably, one for the front and one for the harvester, in the cab there that you probably may not have even taken out of the plastic, but it is worth having a read. Have a bit of a crack at the manual and at least make yourself familiar with where in that manual various adjustment information is. Okay, so that's one to maybe try and do pre-harvest. At least be familiar with where you can access the information you need to make some of those finer adjustments. Now, one of the first things that touches the crop is the reel, and we need to make sure that we're not potentially shattering material out of the head with the reel. So you want the fingers off the reel just to be touching into the crop by about 5 centimetres. Reel speed, in a lot of cases, the automated reel speed setting is too quick for Australian conditions, because what happens is that our algorithm is based on European crop conditions, which obviously are a lot denser crop, and you know, we normally work on a 5% lead for speed, but of course, if we've got a lighter crop, which we often do in Australia than say the Europeans, that reel speed can be way too high and start smashing material out of the head. So adjust your reel speed so it's, you know, in cereals about 5% faster, and then, you know, for something like if you're direct harvesting canola, then you might bring that back to relative to your ground speed to 1:1. Timing is obviously pretty important as well. Make sure that that, as I say, that penetration isn't in too far, and then also the finger position as it comes around is adjusted according to the crop. And in a lodge crop, for example, you might need it to be a little more aggressive to flick material back in onto the front. And at the end of the day, remember, as I said before, we're just trying to aim to lay that crop into the front and present it as uniformly as possible to the board elevator and into the machine. Now, when we get to knives, you know, again, sensible stuff. Just make sure that the knife's nice and sharp. Make sure that your guards are all nice and straight. You know, and that should be done on a daily basis. Just make sure that everything's tickety-boo up the front, and that it's, you know, where you've got a gap in underneath the knife, that potentially isn't going to cut as cleanly, and what that's going to do is shake material out of the head before you know, it even cuts it. So you're potentially going to get some losses there. So just make sure that knife's nice and sharp and that the knife sits down on the ledger plate without a gap in underneath it. One of the most common areas for losses on the front is, as I said, towards the centre, and particularly with drapers, that belt transition point where you get the belt that are travelling sideways in, and then pushing material up, you know, through into the drum. Leakage is obviously pretty common, and so there are things like brush kits, or you can just use flaps of rubber if you're having issues there. I don't know if there's anyone who's had a crack at that there, Tom. Anyone using brush kits, or anyone got straps of rubber, or got any tips or tricks that they're using for the front there, Tom?
Anyone having a crack at this sort of stuff? Where your belt's transitioning, trying to put some extra modifications to your front to sort of stop that leakage outside? Not really. They're available brush kits. You can buy them.
I think probably, you know, the brushes, the likes of brush kits, those that I've spoken to put them on. Some people swear by them. Some people say that they didn't really make much of a difference, and that they've gone back and used just flaps of rubber just to flick material back in up onto that belt. So, you know, there's I think the good thing about the front is that you can do a lot of these modifications yourself, and that brings me to the next point. You know, anyone used core flute or anything like that on the reel to try and just drag material in over the top of the knife? Anyone there?
Duckboards, things like that.
Couple of hands, yep.
Duck feet. There's a couple of duck feet examples coming around from primary sales here.
So look, you know, the core flute options are a pretty cheap and cheerful one. You know, you only put it on maybe 1 or 2 sections of a full revolution on the reel, and you place those randomly so that your eyes don't go crazy over a period of a day. But you know, people have used it, said that it works quite well. Others have used light gauge draper matting and used that just to flap in and lift material back over the top of the knife. And then you've got things like duck feet as well. So anyone used anything else like that? Core flute, duck feet, straps of rubber flap, brush. And of course, then we've got things like crop lifters and finger extensions. So again, I guess my point is that some years, some of these options are going to be needed, and some years are going to be worse than others. So, you know, some years particular solution might really work well in an area or a district just because, you know, the crop conditions at the time, and other years they won't be needed. So I think probably one of the important things that's already been mentioned today is that if you're on social media, that @harvest loss handle is a really good one to follow, and you know, communication with those around you as to what is working for them is definitely worth doing as well. So, you know, just staying in touch with those that are local, and if you're having an issue, you can pretty much be sure that they're going to have a similar issue as well. And so share that knowledge. And as I say, that social media platform @harvest loss is a cracker to just pick up a few tips and tricks and ideas as to what you might do. Pick of an aerial there, you know, just anything that people are using and having success with, you know, is good to learn about. And you know, some of those modifications can pay for themselves, you know, in a matter of days, you know. So, you know, while some of them are pretty costly, minimising those losses off the front can be easily prevented with some of those small mods. So Tom, open to any more discussion and suggestions from the floor there. Over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Anyone, what's the main challenge you think they're facing with getting the crop into the front of the uniform way around here? Heavy crops, still lodging? No issues at all? Everything goes in
a dream harvest environment by the sound of things.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that sharp knives is something you do super easily. Just get them down into your plate and stop that bit of shape and let it fall in, get it nice and even on the front. Ben, here we go.
Well,
Hang on, gotta use this.
I'll just make comment on David. A couple of years ago, we were harvesting beans on a hot day, and we just decided to get out and try and work out how many we'll lose. And we were shocked when we counted the number of beans per square metre, was a square foot column we were working on. And we decided to knock off everyone else was harvesting. I think we worked out about 400 kilos a hectare we were losing. And that was, they weren't going into the front. They were very minimal in front of them tonight. But we were pulling up and looking up, the front had gone over. And there were just truckloads of beans everywhere. And we come back early the next morning when it was actually a very chilly morning. And it was too tough then. We had to killing time waiting for it to hit the sweet spot, but I think we dropped it from about 400 to less, probably only 25 kilos or something, and then by 2 o'clock again. I think a lot of people probably don't realise that on beans, but I don't think there's much you can do about setting up your harvester to pay the beans at a reasonable crop, 3 to 4 tonnes per hectare.
Any thoughts, Ben?
Oh, look, I think the point you're making is absolutely bang on. You've got to know when to pull up, and sometimes I reckon we're guilty of trying to push too far into the evening. Those moisture conditions can come in pretty quickly, and in the same way that when I talked about harvester fires and knowing when to pull up when the FDI was looking a bit shaky, up towards that 35, the decision needs to be made as to whether you pull up there. On the flip side, the same goes with poor threshing conditions, and we can cost ourselves a lot of money and not gain a whole lot as well. So you've got to ask yourself the question as to whether it's actually worth pushing on further into the evening. And I think the point's been made, and it'll be made again, I have no doubt, with Cassie and Brett. You've got to have the machine sort of set up for various periods of the day. You'll have a setting really for the morning, one for the evening, and through the middle of the day, and you'll get beyond where the harvester's comfortable at actually threshing and end up losing a lot of money. So you've got to make that call. I think sometimes it's good to do that a bit earlier, and at least take some of these measurements so you know exactly when you need to be pulling up.
Another question here, Ben.
Yeah, just point on with favourite beans. I think they are our absolute bane. It's trying to get them harvested in a timely fashion. So as Alvin alluded, we tend to we wait for weather change to come through. It's a bit wet for weeks and swap over the beans, and you tend to get about one day, and then the second day you push on when you really decide that you probably should have stopped, and that's just a common fault. Last year we windrowed a few beans in one paddock, and it's the same old story. What was standing, we tried to harvest and it was a bit warm. And I went out after harvest and I went back and done seed counts on that area where I'd done direct harvesting compared to picking up windrow of beans. So in the direct harvesting area, look, in the mornings when it was going good, I was probably having about 15 or 20 seeds per square metre loss. As it got too warm, we'd be up to 80 or 90 seeds per square metre very easily. Go back to where I'd done the windrowing, and I was between about 6 and 12 seeds per square metre where I'd done windrowing. And you can tend to, you can push into those dry conditions. You do a little bit more shacking out of the windrow, look at the same, but nowhere near the losses on direct harvesting. Direct harvesting beans, I think we're all guilty of it. You just keep going just a little bit too long, or just fill the day in. But the losses by the time the end of the day, that's really big.
And do you reckon is that seasonal? I mean, is that going to vary year on year? Your thoughts?
I'd say every year is exactly the same, pretty much. Look, the trouble is, I think we're all, going back to what I think Courtney said earlier, we've heard these stories about your windrow beans and you'll get rain on them, the losses are going to be horrific. But I've thought about that for a while. If you got downgraded to feed beans, it's going to cost you about $20 a tonne, and we don't want to work, we hate going into that number 2 or 3 category. If you sit down and work out the losses compared to losing 100 kilos on the ground, oh, that's okay, but we won't take $20 discount in our beans.
Yeah.
So it's one of those, like, it's some fun things we remember. And also a lot of people around here right into putting their lambs on their bean stubbles, and the lambs do extremely well out of it. I've got a son that hates sheep, so they're not on the farm. So it's a big loss.
Best sheep's in a lamb roast, I reckon, but anyway.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, Tom, just in relation to canola and direct heading versus those who are windrowing? We got any breakdown?
Who's windrow and canola? Pretty much anyone. We're going to try and direct head this year.
Anybody doing both?
Yeah.
Doing both?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've got one more question here, Peter, a comment.
Yep.
Yep. We've got one more question here, Peter, a comment.
Yep.
Mm.
We've got one more question here, Peter, a comment.
Yep.
Yeah, I did some work last year. I think it was Pulse Australia website concerned about a lot of bean losses, and never actually executed it last year. The weather and the crop conditions didn't sort of pan out, but the evidence we've investigated windrowing, and here is 2 inches of rain. You can't pick a windrow up, stuck to the ground, like some of their neighbours have done. But the conclusion I came to is, I think they'll take up to 14% moisture in the beans, and the stems are going to be fairly tough and dewy. And while we haven't actually done it, we might do it this year depending on how it plays out. But it's a strategic desiccating at the right time, just to try and preserve some of that toughness and be like hopefully find a balance between being too tough and I think we're probably get guilty whether it's barley or other jobs. I thought I'm going to leaving the beans too late and it's 35 degrees and they're just absolutely exploding. So that's just a part of the reality of investigating, but whether it plays out this year, time will tell. So yeah, just some comments anyway.
And fair comments too. I think, Alan?
Yeah, back on the beans. Beans is a big crop in this district and the losses. We were windrowing beans quite a few years ago and it worked really well until 1 year after the windrow, we had a lot of summer rain and the losses were horrific because the windrows didn't dry out underneath, but the moisture got there and we had trouble picking them up. And when we picked them up, because the soil was sort of stuck underneath, we were getting pinged for dirt in the beans as well. And so, I mean, it's one of those things you knew you were going to get through harvest without significant summer rain. I think windrowing's the go, but you know, the forecast this year, I mean, it's a bit different to WA. We've only just been getting enough rain here, but if we happen to get the wet summer and we windrow it, I'd say it should be direct bedding. And so it's a really difficult.
We've been stealing all the rain before we send it to you guys. You know, we've just been grabbing on the way through. So unfortunately, there hasn't been much left. You fellas, sorry about that. Yeah.
You can blame Mark for that one. He's put the border up, stop the rain coming.
We know as farmers in this industry, we just have spots because we haven't got the information required to make the best decisions. We're relying on weather forecasts going to use and we're relying on things outside of our control. So I think it's a good point. It's just hard to pick, isn't it? Yeah. Forecasts are saying wet spring, so it's starting to feel a bit right now, isn't it? The decision you make is going to be based in the best decisions, the best data and the best understanding you've got at that time. So you are getting out and you're measuring off the front and you understand what you're losing. Use that information to make a decision that's going to be right with your heart, basically. Feel fun.
Just a thought I had is that we've always talked about in windrowing beans, we talk about when we can actually go and windrow them at the earliest possible time. What is the other end of the spectrum? What is the latest possible time we can windrow? Can we, as Alan said before, oh, it's too tough that night. Well, perhaps we get the windrower out at time when it's tough as hell, can't do anything else. Someone's got to start all night windrowing. But the windrow during the hard, tough bits, and you get 0 losses. And next day, you're out with harvesting when it warms up. It's not stuck to the ground, you know what the weather's going to be doing. And you only ever lay yourself within you only windrowing literally a couple of days in advance, knowing that you can go on and harvest them.
Oh, I'd back Malcolm up on that. We actually did it with barley last year. We knew there was a big wind event coming with. We had plant barley standing during harvest, and we went out and it's not another job you want to do during harvest. We actually knocked the big down with a windrow in the shade. So I reckon you could do it, but if you knew you were going to harvest them in the next couple of days, you could knock it down and get it done.
Project anyway. How do you run it down? Timing of windrowing and beans. Nothing. We have a look into it. If we've got nothing else, we might push on and get started on our losses in the machine themselves. And